Bernard from Montreal. Preparatory communication number 101. The dawn of new consciousness. Man is at the dawn of his new consciousness. So he has not yet begun to really understand the man with whom he lives. He has not really begun to be able to use the more or less perfected creative material of conscious man with which he deals in everyday life. Today's conscious man is slowly, painfully, beginning to be able to use, in exchange with the conscious being, the creative material which passes from the double and through the personality which is not yet fully adjusted. And this creates a great problem for conscious man, because for some time to come they will be obliged to interpret subjectively the action or word addressed to them. And as long as man is not capable of living in the total centricity of his intelligence, he is not capable of completely and perfectly understanding the actions or words of man, with whom he works and lives. In one sense this is unfortunate, but in another sense it is normal. Since the evolution of consciousness that is coming is a new evolution and the very nature of man is being transformed. And as long as man is in transformation, he is obliged to make use of his past to understand his present perfectly. So he is obliged to interpret, according to his memory, according to his attitude, what man says or does, in order to be able to orient himself, in order to be able to give himself an idea of the relationship between himself and the other. But this is dangerous, because interpreting a person's gesture requires that we already have a precise idea of that gesture, when in fact we don't and can't have a precise idea of a gesture or a word, until we are totally outside the polarity of that gesture or word. It is not up to man to interpret the gesture or the word of the other. It is up to man to be able to receive the gesture or the word without vibrating emotionally or mentally. It's up to the conscious human being to be able to absorb the energy of the other without being upset in his own personality. It is at this point that interpretation disappears and the other person is given freedom of action and speech. If man constantly interprets what the other says or does, he automatically forces the other to delay the flow of his creativity for fear of shocking the recipient of that flow. So there's automatically a slowdown in the creative activity of man. There's automatically a slowdown in the development of creative consciousness. And there's also naturally the famous tension that exists between one and the other. Because one who speaks or does the action, not wanting to create tension for the one who receives the word or the action, is obliged to walk on eggshells. And walking on eggshells becomes tiring for the man who says or does the action, because he is constantly obliged to make sure that he doesn't hurt the feelings of the one who receives his word or is aware of his action. So it is necessary and very important for people who are becoming aware to be able to slowly, gracefully, give themselves a certain freedom in speech and action. A certain freedom that allows them to receive speech and action, knowing that even if it is not perfect, it is not rooted in a fundamentally negative or fundamentally backward mentality. Interpreting the action of a conscious person becomes more and more tricky. Because the more conscious the person, the more his action and speech will come under the creative activity of the double. And we know that the creative action of the double through man's speech or action is always an action that goes beyond man's psychological conditions and eventually leads man to attach himself more and more to a higher vibratory energy level than that experienced by the fifth root race, in order to take man beyond his psychological limits. So if man interprets the action of conscious man, it is obvious that his interpretation will be shown to be weakened by the reality that supports the action and the word. And from this interpretation will arise all kinds of suffering. For the man who interprets the conscious man cannot fail to benefit in the long run from his interpretation, since the creative action in the long run will demonstrate the intelligent origin of his quality. When conscious man interprets the action or word of a conscious being, he must realize that this word or action arises from the creative activity of the double through the personality for reasons which suit the double, and which must be gradually absorbed by the personality. So it is obvious that the double, that cosmic part of man, works through the personality in order to create some kind of adjustment on the mental and emotional planes. So it is very important that the conscious being does not succumb to the temptation to interpret the action of the other conscious being, because this action is not delimited by normal human psychology. It is a function of an increasingly supramental psychology, meaning it is a function of an energy which lies beyond the lower mental plane of man. For the conscious being to realize the importance of not subjectively interpreting the action or words of the conscious being, it is necessary for him to consider his own words and actions and to realize that he himself, little by little, is becoming more and more sensitive to his energy, and that the more sensitive he becomes to this energy, the more he realizes that this energy within him is strong and powerful. So if he becomes aware of the creative energy within him, it's only natural that other people should also become aware of the creative energy within them. And this creative energy does not have to be subject to the personal judgment of the personality, since it is not determined according to the laws of the ego but determined according to the universal double's laws, according to the laws of the higher consciousness which, little by little, adjusts to the personality. If we judge or interpret an action that is said to be creative but not adjusted, we place ourselves in a delicate situation in relation to conscious human beings. A situation which may lead us to recognize that we lack objectivity. And objectivity between conscious human beings is very important, because these evolving beings are in contact, at one level or another, with creative forces seeking to descend into matter. So if the conscious being subjectively interprets the action or the word of a conscious being, he will live the veil of his own personality. He will prevent himself from establishing with this being a more and more remarkable link, a more and more creative link. It is not a question of conscious man interpreting the action or the word of the other. It is a question of him being able to absorb this action or this word in an objective way, so that he can, in the long run, transmute the astral aspects of his subjective consciousness and bring to the material plane a form of objective and universal consciousness, which encompasses both his consciousness and that of the other. For two people to get on well in universal consciousness, they must both be capable of absorbing each other mentally and emotionally at the same time. If this is not the case, meaning if one cannot absorb the other, the interpretation will obviously serve him as a tool, but at the same time will prevent him from being able to befriend the other and establish a network of energy between himself and the person he has interpreted. The laws of mental chemistry are very complex. In other words, when a human being speaks or acts in a conscious way that is more or less perfected, he creates a shock in the being who observes him. In other words, he creates an imbalance on the mental and emotional planes. And this imbalance serves to reorganize the other person's emotional and mental energy. But not from the ego, but from the higher plane of consciousness, from the double. Here, in the relationship between two people, one is unable to absorb the energy of the other without vibrating subjectively on an emotional level. This link between the two cannot be created, and automatically it will be necessary in the future for the double of one to work with the double of the other in another way. The laws of mental energy are very complex laws because they derive not from the psychological laws of man, but from the pure laws of the spirit. And these vibratory laws are, on the higher mental plane, organized according to the spirit's power of descent into matter and not according to the reception that the ego can create at will towards this spirit. Involution and evolution are two very different aspects of the psychological, mental and emotional reorganization of humanity. During involution, man was subjected to forms, and during evolution man will be led to understand the law of forms and to transgress the forms that no longer serve his evolution. So on the level of relational psychology between the conscious being and another conscious being, it is absolutely necessary that interpretation, which is part of the psychological mechanicity of the old race, be retained in order to allow the two beings to complement each other in a more or less open dialogue according to the laws of energy. and not according to the psychological laws of human memory. When we interpret the action or word of a conscious person, we automatically subject ourselves to the laws of our memory, and we also naturally prevent ourselves from advancing in the eventual graduation of our energy. In other words, we are selfishly basing ourselves on a scale of values that is part of our old memory, instead of basing ourselves on instant creative action on the part of our receptive consciousness in order to raise the vibratory rate of our mind and adjust the vibratory rate of our emotion in relation to this mind. Interpreting a person's actions or words is not simply a psychological act. It is also an astral act, meaning an act which stems from man's subjective planetary consciousness and which allows astral forces to easily influence the individual's evolution. When man is unable to understand the laws of life, he must slowly and gradually become accustomed to these laws. And in order for him to get used to these laws, certain aspects of them are given to him, so that he can understand that the relationship between him and another conscious being is one that has been established for a very long time, before the time of descent into matter. So if it is decided, before the descent into matter, that two conscious beings must meet in an action and in a word, it is obvious that the predisposition that comes before materialization is already recorded in the evolutionary programming of the two individuals. So it is obvious that two beings who meet in the world, for some experience, are already part of a plan of evolution that has already been programmed before incarnation. This is why interpretation becomes dangerous, because it upsets or obstructs this plan of future evolution. And if the interpretation remains too long, meaning if the ego does not succeed in overcoming this psychological attitude, it will eventually be forced, in time, to overcome this condition so as not to delay its own evolution or the evolution of others. The laws of life are occult laws, i.e., they are laws that have always been hidden from man because man did not have the capacity to understand them. Now that man has the capacity to understand these laws, now that man is sufficiently developed on the mental plane, it is essential that he understand the superior quality of these laws and the subtlety of these laws, so that he can eventually transpose to the higher plane of consciousness aspects of his experience, which in the past served the evolution of the soul, but which in the future will serve the development of his double and his atomic consciousness. It is not in the nature of conscious man to understand these things instantaneously, at the stage he has reached today. But it will be, And this will be part of man's future consciousness to understand very well on the vibratory level that the interpretation of another's action and word is reserved only for those who still have sufficient planetary memory. But when man loses his planetary memory and begins to enter into a vaster memory, a cosmic memory, he no longer needs to interpret the gesture or the word of another, because he is capable of being self-sufficient, meaning he is capable of living or absorbing the energy of another without reflection. And it is when man is able to absorb the energy of the other without reflection that he becomes free, meaning he becomes free from the error that the other can impose on his consciousness because of a lack of perfection. So the psychological security of man is reserved for the person who is sufficiently mature to be able to absorb the energy of the other, without disturbing his spirit by the confusion that a misinterpretation creates or can create. So it is very important for conscious man to understand this, because it is part of one of the great laws of universal consciousness. Not interpreting the action or word of another, but understanding it in its real entity, that is to say in its essence, without veil or reflection, remains man's greatest reserve and security, because it prevents the ego from getting entangled in the problem of the polarity of true and false, lie and truth. So it is very important for man to understand that interpretation leads to judgment and that judgment is the input they give to the astral part of their consciousness. This is why the initiates have always explained to man, and repeated to man, that man cannot judge his brother. Not that he cannot know his brother, but that he cannot judge him. And when we interpret a person's actions or words, we make a certain judgment. Because to interpret we have to think, and to judge we have to have psychological material on which to base our vision of things. A being who has relations with men and who is able to live in relation with them without ever interpreting their words or actions is a being free from men. He is free in the sense that men have no power over him through their mistakes or through their lack of awareness. So from that moment on, this being is able to live with men, to love them on the level on which he finds himself, and not to judge their actions through the interpretation that could easily color his relationship with them. This is why we need to understand the phenomenon of psychological interpretation very well, because it is an astral phenomenon. And it is such an astral phenomenon that it is a fundamental part of human nature and prevents us from seeing clearly. In other words, from being able to relate to others with great ease without being affected in the quality of that relationship. The more the conscious being refines himself, the more he becomes aware, the more his intelligence becomes vibratory, the more he will be able to understand the subtle aspects of higher consciousness, and the more he will be fascinated by the close relationship that exists between creative intelligence and man, but the more he will also be dumbfounded by the heaviness of the human spirit. And the more he will be saddened by man's natural inability to see through the forms which make up his subjective consciousness and which give him the impression of being fair and honest in spirit to the one with whom they have a relationship. If man is to be fair in spirit facing the conscious being, if man is to be fair in spirit to his friendly man, then he must be capable of absorbing the consciousness of the other without vibrating on the plane of his planetary consciousness. And this is not easy, because man has a natural tendency to distrust when the relationship between him and the other is not based on a certain intimate or personalized love. So for man, it is very difficult not to interpret the action of the other, because he must constantly measure the nature of his connection. And yet, the nature of the connection between two conscious men is a nature that arises from a higher consciousness that is more or less perfected, but which, in time, should be more and more perfect. But the ego does not have the patience to wait for this moment, and to make himself secure, to give himself a certain value. He feels obliged to interpret the actions and words of the other because he is not sufficiently secure within himself to absorb the energy of the other without personality and egocentricity being called into question. So the phenomenon of interpretation is a phenomenon of subjectivity. It is part of the subjective consciousness of man. And the more we become aware, the less we will need to resort to this psychological mechanism to interpret, to give value to the action or thought of others. As long as man is unable to relate to conscious man outside this mechanism, he will not be able to objectively appreciate the creative consciousness of another person. He will be obliged to experience this consciousness through the coloration of his own ego, and he will automatically lose contact with the immediacy of the other person's creative consciousness. Interpreting a person's actions or words is part of man's subjective consciousness. This is normal in the present case because, even today, man is not sufficiently in tune with his creative intelligence. So he is not close enough to himself to be able to see or watch the actions and thoughts of others without being obliged to reflect on them in order to absorb and integrate them. As men become more aware of themselves, this mechanism will disappear. Because as they become more centrical, their need for security will disappear in proportion to their centricity, and centricity itself will become the fulcrum of their security. The unconscious human being needs to interpret man's gestures because he does not have instantaneous consciousness. Meaning his consciousness must be reflective in order to be able to report to his brain and be decoded. In the case of man who becomes conscious, his consciousness becomes more and more instantaneous because reflection disappears with time. And when reflection disappears, he no longer needs a rule of measurement, meaning he no longer needs a memory to classify the information that comes to him from outside. So, no longer needing memory to classify this information, it classifies by itself. In other words, it can penetrate its being, without being obliged to go through the subjective mechanism of intellect and emotion. Once man is in this state of spirit, he disengages objectively and instantaneously from any polarized value linked to action or speech. So if action and speech are good, then he has no problem with what he receives. If the action and the word are bad, he acts instantaneously in the same way, meaning he is instantly able to reject the action or the word. But he doesn't do it subjectively or reflectively. He does it creatively. And this is where the point is extremely important. A conscious man who comes into contact with a good word or a good deed has no problem. An unconscious man is in the same situation. But a conscious man who comes into contact with a bad word or a bad action, because of the instantaneity of his consciousness, will be able at the moment he perceives the vibration of the word, of the action, to neutralize it on the spot. That is to say, to neutralize it within himself, but not necessarily to confront the action or the word by means of interpretation. So automatically he can easily reverse what, in an ordinary case, could or would have caused trouble. For example, a conscious man who met an enemy who had become his enemy because of the interpretation of the word or gesture, could easily neutralize this enmity, because he would not interpret the negative action or the negative word of his enemy. So automatically, over time, he could absorb his enemy and make him a permanent friend. The problem of interpretation is a classic problem of the lack of communication between human beings. It is a classic problem because human beings have always tried, through interpretation, to see and understand in a precise and objective way what can only be understood objectively by an intelligence that is beyond the intellectual or emotional polarity of the personality. This is why there are so many communication problems in the world. And since communication between human beings is very important, especially between conscious human beings, it becomes obvious that in the course of the evolution of the root race, human beings will have to surpass themselves on this psychological level in order to live out their friendly human relationships in a conscious way, in a supramental way, and in a way that is totally uncoupled from the old memory. That is to say, from the old psychological mechanisms of the ego. As long as conscious man has not understood this, he will not be able to work in a marvelous way with his friend, with conscious people. Because there will always be situations in life that will serve to perfect this relationship. And if man continues to interpret the gesture of the word of conscious man, it will automatically be difficult to continue a creative and wonderful human relationship. Interpreting the gesture or word of a conscious person is normal in the unconscious man and should disappear with time. But to continue to interpret the action or the word of the conscious being can become extremely dangerous, especially if the conscious being has reached a sufficiently advanced level of evolution for the creative action of the double to allow itself to activate the personality according to a future and occult plan of evolution. So it's very important for man to understand this, because the more man comes into contact with beings who are on an advanced scale of evolution, the more these beings are automatically in close contact with creative forces that naturally tame the personality and adjust this personality to their energy. So if man does not understand this, it is obvious that at the level of his personality he will suffer from a retreat from conscious being, because too many emotions and too much intellect, in other words too much memory, will be poured into the activity of recognizing the polarity of an action or a thought. Creative action, or creative speech, being a kind of extremely subtle vibration, the normalization it must create between two conscious beings cannot be established all at once. This normalization must be established over time. But it is very important and very urgent that the conscious being understands and realizes the importance, the value, and the necessity of taking into consideration the subjective value of any phenomenon of interpretation. The human being is a creative being. And the more he becomes conscious, the more creative he becomes, and the more his personality is subject to vibratory laws which are of a different mode from the one we experienced during involution and at the end of the fifth root race. It is normal for the human being of tomorrow to act on the mental plane and on the plane of action in a totally creative way. In a totally different way from the man of the fifth root race. Moreover, there is no choice. Since this is part of evolution, since it is part of the adjustment of the subtle bodies to the energy. But on the other hand, this change, this transmutation in the subtle bodies of man, bringing thoughts, or other words, and creative actions of a different order, can create a kind of dislocation between men who, in the past, acted and had the habit or attitude of acting in a certain way. The conscious being must be sufficiently centered, meaning sufficiently secure in his personality not to be disturbed by one action or another, by one word or another. The function of man's conscientization, the function of the union between cosmic principles and planetary principles, invokes precisely this future state in man, that of not being disturbed, of never being disturbed by the semblance of imbalance created by the polarity within the form. When he perceives from the outside a word or an action that he does not fully understand. So if man does not fully understand an action or a word, all he has to do is stand back, meaning put himself in a position of neutrality, and wait for this word, which in its creativity must make the journey it must, to create what it must. The same applies to creative action. But if the ego insists on continuing to interpret the creative word or action, which is in fact a word or action of occult origin, it is obvious that the ego will suffer, because his consciousness, his level of consciousness, will not be able to absorb a vibration higher than that which normally forms part of his subjective consciousness. And so the ego will be led over time, however long that time may be, to recognize the accuracy of destruction with regard to the mechanism of interpretation. What makes interpretation natural for man is that man has not yet realized, from his personal experience, that he is in fact a shell. Meaning if man could see himself in a real way, he would see that he is on a certain plane and that on the material plane his personality and so on are just a shell. But since man is not aware of being a shell and does not realize that if he is a shell, the other man facing him is also a shell, he loses awareness that the mechanism for transmitting thought, speech and action is a universal mechanism that becomes more and more perfected as the relationship between the shell and the creative energy becomes one. So in the process of fusion, man learns to work more and more with his energy, and in the same way the energy descends more and more into man. This eventually creates a creative mental situation sufficiently perfected to enable conscious man to use the energy through speech and action in a sufficiently precise and exact way to reduce the need for interpretation. However, depending on what the creative energy wants to do on the material plane in order to adjust the personalities, it may well be that man, in the course of his experience, is obliged to channel certain vibrations, meaning to manifest speech and action in such a subtle way that it is very difficult for the ego, not yet integrated into his energy, to understand and realize it properly. Hence the interpretation. It is obvious, for example, that where the shock of energy is necessary for the transmutation and evolution of man, that the interpretation of the intelligence of this shock, the intelligence behind this word or behind this action, becomes absolutely useless, since the function of the shock of the word or of the action is precisely to create a transmutation of the subtle body of man. So if man uses interpretation to understand or measure the creative action of the word or action, he will naturally find himself confused and faced with a situation that is psychologically inexplicable. It is only when he is in his creative intelligence, in his inner vibration, that he will be able very easily to understand the purpose of this shocking and vibratory action and word. So interpreting the actions or words of a conscious being leads nowhere. Because the more this conscious being grows in consciousness, the more his actions and words will be directly linked to the creative aspects of his consciousness. Aspects which often challenge the very nature of the personality. This is precisely where the problem of merging with man lies. So for man to be at ease with conscious man, he must be able to detach himself from the psychological scope of action and speech, to absorb the energy of this action and speech without vibrating on the emotional and mental level. From that moment on, the consciousness of the two men becomes more and more one. That is to say, both benefit more and more from the energization of speech and action. Both grow in perception. Both grow in objectivity. And both can do things together that defy the natural laws of the lower, subjective psychology of the unconscious man of the fifth root race. To interpret a conscious word is to poke yourself in the eye. Because the conscious word, or the conscious action, in no way reflects the ego. And even if these words and actions are not perfectly conscious, it is important that the person receiving them can adjust to the vibration and not be subject to the form. The conscious man who understands this well begins to stop suffering from the other. A man who no longer seeks to interpret the action of the other ceases to suffer psychologically from action and speech, and can slowly begin to benefit from the other, to feel good with the other, even if the other is not perfectly adjusted. This is of great value because it allows conscious man to develop a deep friendship with the other, even if the other is not yet perfectly adjusted to his energy. And both in the same process grow in consciousness, and there is established on the material plane a link from man to man which is part of the great chain of consciousness of the man of the root race.